Status and privilege increase the risk of police violence. Increasing varieties of conduct now fall under the umbrella of the state's criminal law. That means there are more criminal laws to be enforced and more people likely to violate them. And that means, in turn, that the state needs more enforcers. So it's no surprise that police forces have grown during the last century, that their budgets and mandates have expanded, or that they've acquired faster, more powerful, more frightening tools and toys. Since it can impose penalties for almost any conduct at all, the criminal law is a source of almost unlimited state power. So police forces can be dangerous simply because they are charged with enforcing criminal law. But they're also dangerous because, as enforcers, they're invested with the operational authority to use state-monopolized violence in the interest of maintaining whatever sort of order the state's masters see as desirable. Obviously, police forces contain many conscientious, well-intentioned people. But the role police officers are asked to play makes it difficult for them to be anything other than supporters of the status quo, and the tools, opportunities, and privileges they are given make it easy for some, unfortunately, to use force aggressively. The internal cultures of many police departments reward officers for ignoring constraints on their behavior and demonstrating their machismo through violence. For instance, it was recently alleged that London police officers waterboarded prisoners to obtain information in a marijuana case. Notice, torture is frequently justified with reference to horrific ticking bomb cases, but once it's excused, it apparently becomes routine. Police officers in Virginia arrested a woman for blogging about their activities, citing a statute that made it a crime to publicly identify a police officer for the purpose of harassment. Cops in Texas burst into a home, unannounced and armed, on the basis of an unsubstantiated and suspicious tip to the effect that the home contained marijuana. When the homeowner tried to defend himself against the hooligans he didn't know were police officers, they shot him, and their search turned up no drugs at all. A New York cop beat up and handcuffed a drunken, middle-aged woman who'd stumbled against him. Elsewhere in New York, officers beat two lesbians who were not suspected of any crime, simply because they'd shown up at a scene of an incident as the cops were dispersing bystanders, all the while screaming epithets. Pennsylvania cops beat and maced a 13-year-old boy because he walked away from them while trying to explain on a cell phone to his father that his mother had been involved in a car accident. An Arizona cop arrested a man for jaywalking and urinating in public before handcuffing him, beating his head against the hood of a car, and slamming him into a chain-link fence. Some 24 cops chased and beat a man who was purportedly guilty of the outrageous offense of riding a mini-bike with no helmet and without a license. By the time this outrageous incident was over, 14 people had been arrested for such crimes as trying to find out what was going on and refusing to allow officers into a home without a warrant. When people began filming the police abuse using their cell phones, they were beaten up and their cell phones were stolen by police. These recent stories of out-of-control violence are not stories about bad apples. That's the way apologists for the state and for its police forces like to frame things. But the basic problems are systemic. They result from giving police officers relatively unfettered power to use force and from the culture of violence that pervades many police departments. Suppose you're driving somewhere and notice a police cruiser in your mirror. Suppose it stays behind you as you make multiple turns. Are you likely to feel relieved that you're the beneficiary from some special protection from the heroes responsible for keeping us safe? Or do your stomach muscles tighten as you look nervously while trying not to call attention to yourself for a way to escape? When you read a news story about a cop who reacts angrily or even violently to being filmed, Are you surprised? When the commentator on TV defending the need for greater police powers assures you that you will have nothing to worry about when cameras are installed everywhere, do you wonder what cops think they have to worry about? Perhaps they know on some level that the disconnect between cops and the people they're supposed to serve is continuing to grow. As the recent controversial arrest of Harvard professor Henry Louis "Skip" Gates highlights, many police officers, even decent, responsible ones, seem to enjoy a sense of entitlement, a perception that it's acceptable for them to use force when it wouldn't be okay for anyone else to do so. Too many cops seem to believe that they have every right to harass, arrest, or beat people they don't see as sufficiently deferential. And it's probably not too surprising that they're inclined to react this way. They're servants of the state, and the existence and authority of the state are premised on the notion that some people are more equal than others, that some people are entitled to privileges that others are not, and that it's okay for them to use force to maintain those privileges. Throughout the United States, the federal government is increasingly using funding and other relationships it has built over the last several decades to militarize ordinary police patrol responsibilities, notably by providing officers with higher-end military weapons and, implicitly, encouraging them to use these weapons. It seems that the police officers whose violent behavior should already be giving us cause for alarm are now being prepped to play ever more important roles in maintaining the state's power in the face of civil unrest state officials are clearly anticipating. In a stateless society, people obviously might need to defend themselves against violence, and neighborhood volunteers or security professionals might help. But no person and no protective association would be immune from responsibility for wrongly harming anyone, even in the course of dealing with unjust violence. No one would get a free pass as an agent of the state. Many of the incidents I've just described occurred when police officers were called to assist people or resolve disputes. In a world dominated by the state, safety services are quasi-monopolistic. People often get in trouble for defending themselves, and that means they're often not free to ask people other than government police officers to defend them. People other than police officers are unlikely to want to get involved in potentially violent situations, not only because they might not feel comfortable handling violence themselves, but also because they might themselves be the targets of police violence if police officers arrive and regard them as part of the problem rather than the solution. When you call the state-employed police officers to resolve a problem, you often have, effectively, no choice but to rely on a fixed group of officers from a single police agency. In a stateless society, of course, no volunteer group or professional association would be privileged in this way, and this means that groups that did respond to situations with excessive force, that behaved in out-of-control ways, would be unlikely to receive repeat calls. People would have choices, and people wouldn't likely want to pay for the repeated services of professional safety workers who engaged in violence and abuse. Compensation policies affecting police officers could also contribute to misbehavior on their part. Officers may be paid the same amount whether they are pursuing violent murderers or attacking people who choose not to wear helmets while riding minibikes. It's easy to imagine that, in a tort-based system, compensation for a security worker might come from the damage award paid by or on behalf of someone responsible for an injury whose provision of compensation for the injury was insured by the worker. But when, as in the case of the man on the minibike, no one was injured, there would be no damage award, and so no pool of money from which to compensate security workers who apprehended him. There would thus be no incentive for security workers to pursue him, much less to beat him and multiple bystanders. Without state immunization of police officers against liability for their abuses, without a state monopoly on security services, and without criminal law's creation of incentives for police officers to waste time attending to actions not causing compensable harms, people inclined to act abusively and violently would rapidly be weeded out, and groups of people responsible for the safety of others would be much more careful about who was given responsibility to use force and how force was to be used. By contrast, the state finds it easy to safeguard those who maintain its power against responsibility, even for horrendous acts of violence, and to impose limited sanctions on many of those who are held accountable for abuses. This is both, I suspect, because state officials judge that they need those who engage in violence on their behalf to have a relatively free hand in order to perform effectively, and because some state officials likely welcome the fear their tolerance of this kind of behavior fosters in subject populations. Ending police violence means ending special privileges police officers enjoy as agents of the state. And here we come back to the state as the root of the problem again, because police agencies, the agencies that train and equip and direct the cops, are state agencies. And that means they are protected under the legal doctrine of, quote, sovereign immunity, unquote. The persistence of this doctrine provides more evidence that the modern democratic state is somehow supposed to step into the place of the king. It's a doctrine that began with the assumption that law was the king's and that the king therefore could do no wrong. If the king could do no wrong, of course, then on what basis could anyone claim that the king was responsible for any sort of compensable harm? There aren't that many kings around anymore, and in most societies in which there are kings, the kings are figureheads, not absolute rulers beyond the reach of the law. But now states and their subdivisions are treated just like the king. Governments sometimes graciously consent to let people sue them, but there are limits, especially limits on money damages. And the law often makes it hard to show either that a police officer or other state official acted unacceptably or that the agency supervising the official should have been more careful. Thus, governments and their agencies are protected against real legal liability much of the time. To make things worse, when they do have to pay damages, they can charge the public, since damage claims are ordinarily covered by insurance policies paid for using funds taken from ordinary people at gunpoint. It doesn't seem very fair to ask that those who already pay tribute to the state foot the bill when state officials engage in abusive conduct. In a stateless society, individuals and groups who harmed others while providing protective services couldn't pass the buck to others. They would have to shoulder the costs of the abuses in which they engaged. It's not hard to imagine that they would be much better behaved as a result.